Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Tinnitist TV. Today I am talking to Nick Waterhouse. Now, Nick Waterhouse is no fool, quite the opposite in fact. This California singer-songwriter is one of the smartest people I've had the pleasure to interview lately. In fact, I'm pretty sure he's the first musician I've talked to who's tossed phrases like Joycean epiphanies and gambler's fallacy into his conversation. Even better, he was gracious enough not to make me feel like the doofus I am when we chatted about his fantastic new album, The Fooler. Like his previous releases, it inhabits a vintage, stylistic, and sonic netherworld rooted in classic R&B, jazz, and soul. But it's also his most ambitious work yet, a loose concept album about love and loss and regret and yearning, and the tricks that we play on each other and ourselves. Over a cup of tea, Waterhouse and I discussed The Fooler, working with a producer for the first time, his retro ways, and whether or not Billy Childish texts. Enjoy. All right. Well, Nick Waterhouse, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. I have been enjoying your music for several years now, and I was really glad to get The Fooler. Fantastic piece of work.
Thank you.
You always seem to favor a spring release for your albums. Is that just a logistical thing to have, new music to tour behind in the summer, or is there something more to that?
Spring is the season of birth and rebirth, and it seems to just always work out that way. Crazy because I tend to make the records in like September, November, which happened with this one, and then the timelines just gel for that type of thing. It does make sense to go play shows, and I think that it's a good time to play an album release, entering like a new phase of flowering things. So
That makes sense. And
yeah.
April 1st, The Fooler seems like it's kismet, right?
They wanted March, and I said, guys, it's staring us right in the face. We got to do it. So
I would
it's
think
April
so.
1 or nothing.
And I see you shaved the stash off.
Oh, no. I've got it.
Still got a
It's
little.
there.
Okay.
It's just a little short. It's
I was
dim
gonna
in here.
I was gonna ask if you were, now that you've taken promo pictures and everything with it, you kind of get locked into the stash, right?
It's it's a commitment, but I'm also getting older, so I've decided this is my aging gracefully look.
I
I
hear. Yeah,
appreciate that
well,
you see it.
I understand where you're coming from, sir. Speaking of aging gracefully, this album to me feels like a record that, the word that popped into my head when I was listening to it was perspective, not
Mm.
just within the songs themselves, but in the creation of them. This seems like the work of somebody who is not a 20-something, has been through some life and some changes and some
Hmm.
big time events.
Hmm.
Is that a fair assessment of where you're at now in your creative life?
Very fair, yeah. I think that a lot of if you're an artist, you're not like a content maker. I'm not really making products. Your job is to reflect your experiences and also progress in your process. And this was a record, yeah, very much rooted in perspective and experience. They're songs of experience. Something fascinating that you almost accidentally touched on was, in a funny way, this record takes place in the same city that my first album, Time's All Gone, took place in, but it's in a different, more fluid perspective. You're seeing it omnisciently. You're not down on the street level.
Right.
The way that the energy of, I'd say, the narrative voice in Time's All Gone work is antithetical to what's going on in The Fooler. The Fooler it's almost like between time and space. It's interior, exterior. It's broad. It's focused. And Time's All Gone was more like when I was 24 and a beam of just monologue almost. And this was really a conscious attempt to write a piece, a large piece, a piece that investigated human connections and what people do and mean to each other, and what places, memories, um like why is life worth living? um and I think a lot of the earlier work was like the energy of living really just coming straight out for me.
I don't want to pry. Do you want to discuss some of the personal things that set you down this path?
Yeah, personal things. It's more like I believe that fiction, like a Fitzgerald book is not a a literal transcription of actions that Scott Fitzgerald went through with his group of friends, but you pull from the things that occurred and you find larger philosophical or thematic elements. And for me, a lot of the stuff I had on hand was reflecting on not just a specific relationship that I had in somewhere like San Francisco, but it was all the things I've observed and gotten to know through, you know, the women in my life, um the places that I've found myself living or near. I've traveled so much in the last decade, so you know, I have powerful memories that are 2 days in one city, like I always think of T.S. Eliot referring to London as an unreal city. It's like this unreal city was some synthesis of my life in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Paris, and London, essentially. Um, and it wasn't about a specific partner or lover, but it was just trying to really. I was forced to reflect on these things too in quarantine, because in quarantine, I think the useful thing was that it economized what did you really care about in your life before? Like, what do you miss? You're aware of the absence of these, but also what was like a lot of noise and static, and what were the core experiences that you suddenly are left recalling? And that for me was, some elements of a life that I knew that is now totally gone, almost like a Christopher Isherwood book, in the city. And I put some of that in the press release, but I don't want to make it so literal that people just think like, oh, it's all about this person and this place or something.
No, and it doesn't come off that way. It doesn't
Mm,
come off as a narrative,
mhm,
per se, but it does hang together. You mentioned setting out to write this sort of longer form work.
mhm,
Um, I'm curious about how I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, here's something I think I'd like to do, but then you actually have to sit down and
mm,
go through the process of I got to come up with this many songs and I want to make them hang together, and that would seem to be, I mean, I guess the facile comparison would be the difference between writing some short stories and trying to write a novel.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
was it an exponentially harder challenge for you than just writing a song and then another song and then another song?
Definitely. And it also wasn't like so uh, contrived as being that. It was more like there's a larger concept that I find myself drawn to investigate. The things I'm pondering, and then the things I'm finding in my notebooks, because again, that's what notebooks are for. And a lot of these songs, there's like 80 pages of things that were written or rewritten or fragmentized, or there's an entire block of text that only 2 lines from that ended up in this song. But that stuff becomes like a swirl of a process, and the process is what I really enjoy, like beyond enjoy, I feel compelled to do.
Sure.
Um, and so this record, I find I orient myself around not even goals, but knowing like, okay, I know that I'm thinking about this. All right, I'm writing a song like Are You Hurting? Okay, I'm in this mood. I'm ruminating on these things through the day. I go for a walk and I think about this stuff. I know I'm talking to Mark Neal a lot, who's gonna produce the record. I know I'm gonna go to Georgia. So if I bounce off of all those things through the days, that becomes this like kinetic energy that propels me. And knowing also I just have to do it. I read a lot about the process of, writers. You do have to just decide to sit down every day, and without even making it too ritualized again or contrived, you're just trying to get into a state where you're receptive to your own concept. So that was probably, if I have to be literal about explaining the process, that's the closest I've come to date. I haven't really explained it to somebody else.
That's a pretty good explanation. No, I get it. Talking about the amount of writing you're doing and journaling, and
Mhm.
is that, I mean, have you always been somebody who
Yeah,
kept a journal and all that? So,
I'm like a compulsive uh scrap taker, like a note taker. Um a lot of my early songs when I was living in the city in my 20s, they were all written on the bus or like on receipts, or I'd always have a little notebook. I'm not like, I envy ritualistic journal writers, but it's usually if it comes. So I'm kind of an impulsive writer. I just happen to have impulses almost every day. But when I'm working on a record, then I start really deciding to have a writing schedule, so to speak. Like I know for sure I need to sit down and be alone with this concept for at least an hour, or until I feel like I've written out what I was thinking.
right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I there's one of these around a lot, but it's there's I don't have a set meaning. And sometimes I'm like, damn, if I really focus myself and chose one size and one thing, maybe I would be even more efficient. But I'm a sloppy musician. I'm not a real writer.
You seem to be doing a pretty good impression of a real writer.
Thank you.
Is it always diaristic, or do you sometimes just write fiction?
Oh yeah, it's everything. It's whatever's in my mind. So there's
Okay.
fiction. Um, I wrote some fiction in my 20s, like that I actively worked at like hashing out the form, and I see those more as exercises now, not really like worked, because I don't think I knew what I was saying or what I wanted to say. I think sometimes now about writing some fiction. I do have two outlines of sort of like films that I was possibly going to work on with a friend, and they're written more like a. I write. I find that I tend to write more uh, story style, narrative style than like I don't really know the structures of like film treatments. So
Right. You mentioned earlier on, that some of this was prompted by asking yourself or looking for answers and questions of what makes life worth living and things like that.
mhm,
Did
mhm.
you did you work through any answers to those questions, do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's the point of the record.
Hmm.
Uh, it's like I'm a student of like Joycean epiphany, like moments of inner truth, usually triggered by true human connection, love on a deep and spiritual, or like uh the common like unconscious connection, like when two human beings, like I think that that's where white magic occurs, like it makes things tangible. I also think that there's internal moments where gears turn that no one else around can see, and that's what is the value of a human life, is like all these things led up to some spark that is even intangible. You can't articulate it. And music is really magical because music is um not it's nonverbal in a way too. So it works on it like multiple planes at once, and it can also like make you feel something that's sensory, that isn't even that's beyond language. And I also give counterfactuals in the record, which is like what songs like No Commitment or Unreal are, which is like what in the face of an increasingly unreal world, uh, you contrast that against something like Late in the Garden or Looking for a Place. And those are the truths. You can see truths more starkly.
Right. And there's that a lot of that interplay I find in the album, sort of the difference between maybe what reality is and what we think of, or the nature of memory, and because we all live inside our own
Hmm.
unrealities, as it were, right? Because we're all
Sure.
making up our own, and
Yes.
congratulations, by the way, on being the first person who's ever used the words Joycean epiphany in a music interview. Um,
Thank you very much.
Talking about the sound of the album, I want to definitely discuss that, because for me, it is tied in with that whole nature of memory and perspective and unreality. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a very soft and enveloping production
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. At least that's how it strikes me on what I've heard.
Mhm.
Was that, I'm presuming that was somewhat intentional. Was that something that you discussed with Mark in terms of wanting to kind of round off the edges of the sound and kind of create this sonic, I don't know, blanket for people, or what?
Yeah, so Mark, a big part of working with Mark was that we spent so much time discussing not just records to copy, but records that were part of this sonic place. And a sonic place in their time, I'm thinking of records by people like Little Anthony and the Imperials or Burt Burns Productions. New York City records. We talked about a lot of New York City records, but records that were like not hard New York records. They had some of this, the mystery of like a park at dawn, like when you're walking down a city street and no one's around. Um, and that a big part of the psychic geography of San Francisco for me was all these records that felt and sounded this way at a certain time in my life too. And the fact that they stylistically would cradle a lot of the concepts that I was bringing in, and Mark was very sensitive and uh, as a producer, he has deep emotional intelligence for that sort of thing, and so it all, he kept saying the sound is the place, and so I think to deliver this story, which is essentially like novelistic, but also sonically it's novel, like the instrumentation, the chord changes I was using, I was outside of the zone. I mean, it was very funny. I did a German interview the other week and they're like, from the first note of the record, it's like, this is not a Nick Waterhouse record as we know it, which they wanted a raggedy, swinging, saxophone driven, energetic, immediate feel, which is what people, that's what other records I've made can sound like. But this is the Fooler, like this is another thing. And so the palette is adjusted to serve what the entire, I mean, that's the point, that's the agenda
Mhm.
here. So
Right. It
yeah.
doesn't feel like a reinvention of your sound or anything. I mean, I didn't put this on and go, what has happened to Nick Waterhouse or anything. It feels just more like the next chapter, the next
Sure.
evolution. Um, this was the first time that you really essentially haven't produced yourself, right?
True. Yes. Yeah.
Was that was that something that you actively did not want to do this time, or was that something that just came up because of your friendship with Mark, and was
No,
that
that
a
was actively, yeah, that was a
okay?
decision consciously. Mm.
What was behind that?
Well, it was to see what would happen if I just became the artist.
Mhm.
And a lot of my process since I've started was being this sort of like split mind where I had to dissociate to become the producer at certain minutes, like down to minute by minute. Like sometimes I'm the singer, sometimes I'm the writer, sometimes I'm the band leader MD, and sometimes I'm the producer.
Mhm.
And for me, Mark was one of the only people that made me feel comfortable with the notion and interested in the concept of just becoming the artist and bringing in this, like, so I could take the bandwidth that I would have to divide and focus purely on, I'm a singer-songwriter, these are my songs. And Mark was very encouraging of me taking that role on. Of course, I had like tons of participation, again, speaking about the agenda of the sound with him, but I trusted him because we talked about so many things leading up to this. I mean, we logged more than 100 hours on the phone talking about like sonic references and things we loved and, all this stuff. And I also went to learn from him because it's part of this continuum of knowledge, like recording and making records. And it was a really touching, experience. It was different and it was very intense for me, but it was great because it made me make a different record than I would have made if I had just done it by myself or with a co-producer as I've done here in the past.
In the moment, was it difficult? I mean, were there times in the studio where you wanted to go, and
Yeah.
had to just kind of
Oh
go,
yeah.
nope, I'm going to let him do his
Mhm.
thing and I'm going to stay over here.
Certainly. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it was scary. That's frightening because, my intuition would tell me one thing and he would want to do the opposite. And I just surrender to that. And that was what I was doing. I decided to do that and took that as part of the adventure of doing it this way. And also pursuing, I believe in like seeing a vision through. So I had a vision and Mark had one and I didn't want to jump off the horse. And so to me that's also another thing that will define the record. And when you think about records, like philosophically, you're creating an artifact, but you're also capturing a moment in time, and that was that moment.
Right. You
Mhm.
mentioned learning from him. What do you think you learned from him?
Mm. Quite a few technical things,
Mhm.
a lot of history relating to technical and spatial things, but then also just philosophies of
Mhm.
operating that he has developed on his own. It's a lot like chefs or practitioners of karate. There's like the core facets and you learn all these things, but then over time you understand that everyone has their own not shortcuts, but like filigrees and little extras, and even developing whole other schools of thought because they've had the time to ponder in years. I mean, Mark's been making music since the 70s. And so I'm Mose Allison's one of my favorite artists, and Mose up until his death was saying, I'm every day is on the job training since I
Well
was
said.
16 years old. So yeah.
Also, I mean, when you were sort of again in the studio in the moment, it must have been
Mhm,
interesting to, as you said, not have to kind of switch gears and switch
mhm,
headspaces. It allowed you to just remain in that mindset. Almost, I guess, I would compare it to an actor who gets to stay in character for the duration of a shoot. Is that
mhm.
was that something that you felt kind of impacting or had an impact on the way you were able to deliver these songs kind of emotionally and as a character, so to speak?
Definitely. And there was the aspect too of performing them for Mark,
Mhm.
not for myself. Because when I'm producing myself, I'm a critic of myself.
Mhm.
And that can get you can get in a fog of war.
Right.
And with a producer, you're looking for in that moment, you're looking for their validation.
Mhm.
Was that good? Did it move you? Do you like this? I'm not so weak that I collapse, but it's like, you rely and you trust that person to be the ears. You're not the ears anymore. You're just the voice or the character or the story, and that was a lot of how the songs worked too. Like, what do you think about this? And Mark would be like, yeah, that's great. Now let's try it minor. And I'd be like, weird. Okay. You're asking, I'll try it. Um, so that was a big part of the process.
Would you go through it again?
Yes, but I don't know which work would need it,
Right. I mean,
like.
obviously, but it's not like, okay, I did that, I got it out of my system. Now I'm
Mhm.
going to go back to doing it myself.
I'm a true believer that I don't have the gambler's fallacy. Like, I don't think that I don't think there's any relation between the last attempt at something and the next attempt at something. I
Okay.
think everything is starting over from zero every time. People get very superstitious that way, and they actually make work that isn't, they don't challenge themselves. And I've seen friends and peers, and I've read, the books of history will tell you that people can burn out that way or get stuck. I think of the people behind you on the wall.
Sure.
Think about how many changes Iggy
Both of
Pop
them.
had to go through. Yeah, but like that specific period of Iggy Pop's one of my favorites.
Hmm.
But then it was like something totally unexpected where he had to be open and change completely, but he started from zero in this weird way.
Yeah. Yeah. And now he's 75 and still working.
I just saw him like in December. It was crazy.
Oh yeah, no, I'm going to Vegas next month, so I'm hoping
Mm,
for well, another great Iggy experience. What can you say?
yeah.
But so this was definitely an experience where you didn't come out the other side going, "Oh, that was a mistake. I'll never do that again."
No, no,
Okay.
no,
Um,
no.
you mentioned, I think it's in the press kit that you said that your last album, Promenade Blue, was like shutting a door.
Mm.
Um, I'm wondering if you can sort of elaborate on that for me. And did this other door open right away, or was there a period in limbo that you kind of had to find where you were going?
Promenade Blue. So Promenade Blue is like uh the last days before quarantine, we were in the studio doing overdubs and mixing that record. And I was on a endless cycle for almost 9 years since my first record of like this rhythm that was inescapable and always it was like always being slightly behind the eight ball, always active. Always, you're going on this tour, you're working on this thing, we're short on money, we're going on this tour, you're never going to have the band you want.
Right,
I love the band I have, but you want nine pieces, we can only afford seven. We're going on tour, we're doing another record.
right.
And nothing was, I mean, I'm very lucky because I'm not an artist who like hates playing my songs, but I'd been touring and a lot of the set was very similar in arrangement, in feel, in like there had become a common language, which is like I was consistent as an artist, but it also meant that, you know, Time's All Gone, Holly, Never Twice, Self-Titled, and Promenade Blue all feel very sonically. There's a massive thread through all those. Any one of those songs could appear on any other record. There's different production and some different arrangements, but you know,
Right.
um,
They're consistent.
they're consistent.
Yeah.
Like, and I I realized that the launch of my career was because I made my son plays 45 and I lived in San Francisco, and then I went through this massive breakup, and that breakup was like rocket fuel to make Times All Gone, and I was in out in the world as a performing artist since then, and I never really caught up with myself.
Mm.
Um and in Promenade Blue, I expanded my palette so wide, but still within the means of which I was doing even my first record. Like Very Blue or Place Names isn't that far off from Reina on my first record. in terms of chords and sensibilities of arrangements, except now I have strings, and now, you know, Paul Butler and I have found all these ways to do this, and I have more sophisticated horn arrangements and all this shit that I really liked. But I realized that was like, that's 5 records. Those are all part of one block of a body of work. And because of the enforced break, I didn't have to go out and play all those songs
I get you.
and be caught on this like carousel of continuing an unbroken cycle of survival as an artist, or whatever I am as a
Mhm.
performer. Um, so I actually had time to delve deeper, and in this funny way, like, you know, the lyrical themes on Promenade Blue are like starting to become more reflective and introspective.
Mhm.
And then the Fooler is like all the way through the Looking Glass into like meaningful fictional introspection, where I can kind of like I tickled the nerves in a song like Place Names of what I fully achieved in the Fooler. And that's honestly what I feel as a writer.
So do you think then that the next block of albums are going to be consistent in that, in the same way the first 5 were, or do you think that this is just kind of, you've started down a new path and we'll see where it goes?
I think that what's going to happen now is that I'm expanding outward.
Right.
And so I don't have a clear, um, like, uh, raison d'etre to give to you. Like, I don't have the thing that's like, yeah, this record's going to be like this. But I could easily see it being that there are many different moods, and I feel unafraid to explore whatever's like moving me. And I don't have the need to like cling to what I know in terms of, but also my career, it started very narrow bandwidth because I made my first album in the studio I grew up in. It was like hanging on by my fingernails. Like,
Yeah.
I know this chord on the piano. I'll play this. That's all I know. You know, like, I know these people, I know this place, and give it all. Like, it's like be the best janitor I can be. You know, you're gonna sweep the floor, sweep it the best you can. And now I'm feeling freer in this way. So um it's probably gonna be more exploratory, which I would hope would happen. I'm entering another decade, you
Yeah.
know, and who
I'm
knows what
surprised
those records would be like.
I'm surprised to hear you use the word unafraid, though, because I would think that that freedom is both simultaneously thrilling and absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, well, uh I don't really, well, I care very little about how I am perceived, which I didn't care a lot in the beginning. It was just disorienting to be a public. I didn't want to have like photos or give interviews or do anything. I just wanted to make records when I started. Mm. And then when I started doing those, I felt like it never bled into my work, but as a person, it started to feel really poisonous.
Hmm.
Um, but now I've come all the way around to where I also feel, well, I don't feel like I'm gonna disappoint an audience. That's probably the best way I could put it.
Right.
Because it's not that I don't care about them, but I'm just like, stick with me, see what I give you. You'll probably like it if you liked what I did before.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the same though. Don't look to me to be a McDonald's cheeseburger. It's not going to be the same thing all the time.
And but obviously you don't fear the blank page. Do you ever get writer's block?
Mm. Yeah, but the trick is, I don't think of it that way. It's just like nothing's coming right now, and maybe tomorrow something's going to come, and you get the like one foot in front of the other mentality. And I have a lot of other things that I can work on that isn't.
Right.
I
You're not
also
just
don't
having to
mind
sit
if I
there and
never
stare
write
at
it.
that blank page every day.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not obligated to it.
Right. Right.
Um, so that's I'm lucky. I'm lucky that way, but you know, I don't know if I've written a great song yet. It's just I'm just doing the best I can with what I have, and I'll continue to do so, and
Yeah.
that's my philosophy.
I think you've written several great songs, and I'm sure there are more to come. I want to ask you though, you started off recording in mono,
Hmm.
and then you did a couple of albums that were not in mono,
Hmm.
and now you've gone back to mono.
That's right.
Um, what is what is your relationship with that? Why mono? What does it do for you? Does it change the way you write songs? Does it change the way you record things? Does it make life easier, harder?
Mono is like breathing. It feels so natural to me that it's unconscious, and everything just feels better when it's happening that way. And
Hmm.
that's genuinely, I think basses sound better. I think drums sound better. I think vocals sound better. I just, and I think the way that people listen to music now, especially
Hmm.
like on their phones, it makes way more sense. And uh, I,
It's mostly a technical thing as opposed to a romantic thing.
well, it's both. That's my whole career. It's half technical, half romantic.
There you go. We summed it up. We
Uh,
solved the problem.
yeah, that's it. But mono is like a a record propels you more when you hear it in mono.
Hmm.
You can put all the emotion and stuff. Stereo is like making your song into a, it's too, it's just distracting. That's the best way I could say.
Okay.
And you can make really rich 3D sounding stuff in mono.
Hmm.
I always really, I mean, it's funny to say it, but like there's that Spectre thing where he said, "I don't trust the listener to set up their own speakers,"
Yeah.
you know?
Back to
And
mono.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, and it's not about insulting the listener, but I just want to take all, I want to get rid of, it's like paleo, like I want to get rid of all the frills so that like whoever's listening to it, they're going to get the same experience whether they're playing it out of their little iPhone speaker or they're playing it on a hi-fi. And the
I think
song had
someday
better
you should.
sound good.
I think someday you should do like a quad mix of one of the albums, except just have the same mono mix in all four channels.
I had a friend, well, Paul Butler, who did my fourth and fifth records with me. He's getting Atmos certified, so he's in the opposite direction. And he's like, "Nick, it's crazy, man. We could remix." And I'm like, "What do we? What's an Atmos recording of my music? VR music of like, wreck the rod doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but
Uh-huh. Are you something of a Luddite in general?
no. I mean, I just I like good things that are I like good things that are easy to comprehend. So like, um typically, like, I also understand why I like, or I learn why I like something. Like, oh, I like a tube amplifier because this thing fails and it distorts in a way that sounds nice.
Hmm.
Or like, I like a record because I could never understand why there was this fizzy, weird thing on the edge of a cymbal sound for 5 years on stuff that I heard on Pro Tools, and then it was like, oh, it's dithering. I had to fucking learn what dithering was so I could explain why it felt bad. I just want to go back to listening to the record.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm not really a Luddite. I just am very function driven. My dad was a mechanic and a fireman and an engineer. Like he drove the fire engine, and we worked on, and he'd show me like motor parts and stuff.
Hmm.
So I understand systems, and I typically apply that mentality to like what it is I want. So instead of being like, ah, new, bad, instead it's like, if it's new and it's shitty, I don't want it. But if
Sure.
it's new and it solved a problem, I'll take it.
Yeah, but you do seem to have a real connection to the past, sonically, stylistically, musically,
Sure. Yeah.
which is kind of incongruous. I mean, you're mid-30s, you're a California kid. You should really be at this point an aging skate punk.
Yeah. Well, I was a skate punk when I was 6 years old, you know.
Oh,
Uh, but that
well,
stuff feels disposable to me. So it's just cheap. All of it feels cheap. Um, it doesn't feel, there's not a lot of meaning there. Uh, I think people can have rewarding and enriching lives, but like I always wanted something a little more. And the other thing about all the stuff that you're referring to, like being connected to the past, like that was a golden era. That was like a perfect ratio of like technology, talent, just enough technology, but not too much so it wasn't getting in the way of like real talent. And then that weird X factor of all this energy, like going on. Um, and I've been a part of scenes that have micro versions of that that have energy. I mean, the Southern California punk scene that my dad was around for in the late 70s and early 80s had that, but I don't really throw on like a TSOL record and admire the sonics of it and the philosophy behind it as much as I do like something like a Howlin' Wolf record or a Dionne Warwick record. And those are different worlds, but they have the same thing, which I think is like a nexus of energy and personalities and technology, which is really what a big part of recorded music was.
Right. I always feel like you and James Hunter and Billy Childish should be on like a text chain together or something.
I don't know if Billy Childish texts.
No, I doubt he does actually. Yeah,
Probably semaphore, like Morse code.
yeah. I was going to say postcard,
James,
but even that would probably be too.
yeah, James is funny. I hung out with James a couple times down the pub, and like he's a great guy to chat with. I mean, that would be quite a gentleman's club. I wonder how long we would all stay together. It would fracture quickly, I'm certain.
I would think, yeah. Well, especially once you put Billy into the mix, I would suspect. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was your guitar playing, because I really love your style and your tone, and I'm wondering where it comes from. Who were some of the people who you were listening to that you went, oh, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, like, you know, everybody from Steve Cropper and Loman Pauling and Joe South on like some of my early memories are like Joe South on the Aretha Franklin Atlantic records. Um, but also like, you know, I think of like I listened to there's actually also this session player who played on a lot of New York um records that we could never figure out what his name was. And it turned out he was he's the guitar guy who wrote the lick for I Want Candy. Um
Uh-huh.
shit, I'm trying to recall it's not Wild Jimmy Spruill, but it's the other guy. And he's all over all these Solomon Burke records, and he's
Okay.
always playing these kind of frantic, short little non-leads. And I think the combination of that and then like British beat players like Billy Harrison from them and Hilton Valentine from the Animals
Hmm.
and stuff I didn't know was young Jimmy Page. Um those all kind of like were this melange of and Stone like early Stones. My uncle gave me those LPs. Um but then when I was already pretty young, I just started getting into the zone of R&B 45, so just singles that were records from like little private label Shreveport things and weird Detroit and Chicago stuff where I liked rhythmic I like rhythm hook players and then I like angular and aggressive probably from growing up in Southern California um in a scene that I don't know what to call it. It's not a garage scene, which is what everybody says, but it's like it was just art rock music in Costa Mesa in the early 2000s. I didn't like really that stuff, but I think the energy of that time was like what I was growing up around. And then philosophically, since I'm not of the old generation, it's like people like Robert Quine probably were,
Yes, sure, yeah.
and that was on my radar. And I mean, I wasn't a huge Tom Waits fan, but you know, a lot of the New York people and their attitudes towards historic music probably informed me more than I realize.
Yeah, the Quine thing is that's a good, yeah. Because now thinking about it, I mean, there's a lot of New York in that, in some of your, so again, some of the stinging tone. I mean, you can take it back to Richard Lloyd too,
Yeah.
and television and
Yeah. I liked those bands, and I really, really do like tone. I like sound. So the first time I was exposed to recording and I was young, I was like, why does this sound like not just shit, but it sounds like a vacuum? There's no space and there's no breath and there's nothing. So in this weird way, like I would, even last week I was at the studio and they were talking about like we were just having a chat about like my sound that I like. And I'm like, well, a big part of my guitar sound is just uh distant. It's like space.
yeah.
Like all my records, there's like sometimes the guitar mic is off. It's just the guitar in the room, which you hear on a lot of like Bobby Blue Bland records and Jess stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
So yeah, but then I'm a modern kid. I'm not a black bluesman from Shreveport who moved to Chicago. So you end up with this other language, and that's kind of my language. But I love sound. Like tone and sound are so big for me with guitar, and finding feel, like where is the pulse as opposed to notes. Sometimes that's more important to me.
That must be, or potentially at least, frustrating in a live setting where, you
You're
have
totally out of control.
yeah, where you're just, kind of, you got to get up there and play these songs
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, how do you sort of deal with that and balance that against okay, the people who are coming to the show may like my guitar tone, but it's not why they're coming to see me,
Mm, mm. Well, that's where I get the I don't really care. I do it like I do it. I have a mindset when I'm doing it that I know why I'm doing it and who I'm doing it with, like the band or and a lot of the tricks that I learned early in my career was like telling sound people to turn down almost everything that they think they need to turn up
right? So you're
and
the
let
opposite
the
of every other guitar player in the world.
yeah. 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 Billy Childish is pretty interesting because there's stories about how he would tour and they'd be like, no, we're not using any of your sound equipment. We have our own
Uh-huh.
20-watt PA, and it's the volume of the drums and the amp. Or somebody like Jonathan Richman too, who
Right.
insists on no PA
Hmm.
and no air conditioner. Um, I think a lot about that. As I go further into my career, I'm trying to figure out how I can try to incorporate more sound design, but I was always surviving a tour. I was never really in charge of a tour. And
Sure.
playing to me was just attempting to connect with the songs in front of an audience in a way that wouldn't be totally selfish, but also wouldn't be like I'm trying to give them whatever show they want.
Do you think you're still in that position, or do you feel you're kind of reaching a point where you can have a little more control and, you
I
know?
think I'm at that point now. That's where I'm
Okay.
entering, and I'm definitely like the strange thing was like the Promenade Blue tour was so successful
Hmm.
in a way that was unanticipated that felt also like shutting a door because that was the last tour with that band with the horns and everything, and I'm about to go do this tour for the Fooler with no horns and no backup singers.
Oh, really? Okay, so that's gonna kind of make you either limit what you do, I think, or reinvent a lot of the
Hmm.
older songs, right?
Yeah,
Or what's,
definitely.
I mean, what's the plan? Is it coming out and playing the Fooler front to back, or what?
Yeah, and
Oh,
then a
wow.
couple extra songs, and I have a second guitar player, which I've never done before. And those rehearsals have been really interesting with the interplay of those two things. Um, and we'll see what happens in the summertime because, there's more touring on the horizon, but I get to decide now like what part of my catalog I want to perform and how I want to do this. Like what do I want to be? And it's very exhilarating.
Cool. Well, please come to Canada.
Okay, I will. It's coming. I'm told in September. So
All right. Well, hopefully you'll come through my part of the country so I can see you.
where are you? Are you on the
I'm
east or the
right
west
smack
coast?
dab in the
Oh,
middle of Canada, right above North
Calgary?
Dakota. Hmm?
Calgary?
I'm
No.
in Winnipeg. I'm
Oh, Winnipeg. Okay.
yeah, 12 hours to the east of Calgary. I'm right smack above North Dakota.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been up there once.
Have you?
Yeah.
When was
Just
that?
on, just on a trip, not on a show.
Okay.
Yeah. I was traveling. I was on my way to Banff.
Oh, there
So
you go.
doing a long drive. But yeah, I would love to do a real proper Canadian tour. I think I think we're gonna be doing a lot of different stuff starting this year. So maybe I'll show up in your town.
I hope so. Well, listen, my friend, I could spend another hour talking to you. This is fascinating.
Thank you
Um,
very much. Yeah.
and but I know you've got other things to do. So I will let you go and say thanks so much for your time and thanks for another great album. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you somewhere down the road.
Of course. Thanks for the thoughtful questions, and I really appreciate it, man.
All right, take care. Bye.
Take it easy.